Good morning, everybody. Very nice to be here. I want to start off on a very somber note. I hope it'll end up being a liberating reflection. My sense is, I don't know if I'm right, but my sense is that we may be facing the possibility of our own extinction in the next century. It's so hard to say this, because the minute it comes out of my mouth, I think over the top, melodramatic. And I'm mindful that throughout history, we've had many prophecies of doom, and thank God they've all turned out to be wrong. But I'm going to share with you a statistic, and you mull this over in your mind this morning. I think this statistic will stay with you for the rest of your life. I teach at the Wharton School. It's the oldest business school in the world, and I teach CEOs. And they have to suffer through 5 weeks of advanced education in midlife. And the minute they walk in that door, the first thing I say to them is that the primary economy of the earth, the primary economy is photosynthesis. That's the true bottom line. Now, we human beings, we are the youngest species in the evolutionary neighborhood. We're the babies on the block. We've only been here about 175,000 years as anatomically modern humans. We have 6.8 billion in numbers right now, but we only represent 0.5% of the living biomass on this planet. 0.5%. We're currently devouring 24% of the photosynthesis of the earth. And we're heading to 10 billion people. We're monsters. This little species is devouring this planet. This is not sustainable. This will not last. Species come and go. There is no fait accompli that we'll be here forever. We've had 2 events in the last 2 years which I believe signal the end game for the great industrial age based on fossil fuels. July 2008, remember that month. In that month, oil hit $147 a barrel on world markets. Prices went through the roof. Everything from groceries to petrol. We had food riots in 40 countries. People could not afford rice, wheat, barley. And when the prices went up, panic around the world. The reason is everything is embedded in fossil fuels in this civilization. We usually think of it as just power for our automobiles, but most of our food is grown in petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides. All of our construction materials are based on fossil fuels, from plastic to cement. Almost all of our pharmaceutical products are still petrochemical based. Most of our clothes have some form of synthetic fiber. Our power, our transport, our heat, our light, we have built an entire civilization based on the burial grounds of the Jurassic Age. We exhumed those remains, those carbon deposits, and we built one of the great, perhaps short-lived civilizations in history. I try to imagine if our species does survive. I try to imagine what human beings will think of us 100,000 years from now when they look back at this point in time. The pyramids will be gone. All the great monuments will have disappeared. And the only record they will have that we ever existed was our carbon footprint and our methane footprint and our nitrous oxide footprint in the geological record. And they'll say, oh yes, way back then, they were the oil people. We had the Bronze Age and we had the Iron Age. They were the fossil fuel people. So when oil hit $147 a barrel on world markets, prices across the supply chain shot up and purchasing power plummeted. We had a free fall. And the entire economic engine of the Industrial Revolution shut down in July of 2008. That was the earthquake. The collapse of the financial market 60 days later was the aftershock. Our world leaders are still dealing with the aftershock. They haven't addressed the earthquake. This is what I call peak globalization. We now know the outer wall of how far we can globalize in a world based on fossil fuels. Why did we hit peak globalization? Because of something called peak oil per capita, which do not confuse this with global peak oil production, which you probably know about. They're 2 different things. Global peak oil production is a geological term, And it refers to when half the oil reserves of the world are used up on the classic Hubert bell curve in geology. When half the oil reserves of the world are used up on that bell curve and we hit the top of that curve, it's over because you can't afford the prices on the quick downside of that curve. There's controversy, but it's narrowing about global peak oil production. Many, many years ago, in 2001, the International Energy Agency, they were the optimists, said, well, at a 3% growth rate, this was before China and India made their bid, maybe we peak around 2035. But in the interim, some of the great geologists in the world, with new computer simulations, better oil and gas reserve figures, their studies show we'll probably peak between 2010, that's this year, and 2020. One of the great geologists said we peaked last year. Even the IEA has now reformulated their projection and say supply crunch 2014. I have no idea who's right about global peak oil production, but it makes no difference now. They're now arguing about 10, 15, or 20 years. How do we create a new energy regime and rebuild all of civilization in that amount of time? It takes my breath away. But the reason we hit peak globalization at 147 a barrel is something called peak oil per capita, and there's no controversy here. It occurred in 1979 at the height of the auto age, the second industrial revolution. BP did the study, confirmed by other studies. If we were to distribute all the oil reserves we knew we had in that year to everyone that existed on the planet at that time, that's the most each person could have if we shared it equitably. We found more oil since then, but population rose quicker. So if we distribute all the oil reserves we know we have today in the world to 6.8 billion people, there's simply less to go around. So I think you see where I'm heading. When China and India made a bid to bring 1/3 of the human race into the second industrial revolution at a 10% growth rate, prices skyrocketed. And once you go over 75 and 80 a barrel, inflation hits across the supply chain. And at 147, purchasing power plummets. We can't afford anything. Now, you notice that we are now replenishing inventories, and there was a slight bit of growth. What's happened? Energy prices went up. And now we hear today in the newspapers that the housing market is completely bottomed out again. So oil prices are going down because economic activity is halting. Here's what I'm suggesting to you. Every time we try to regroup this economy and regrow it at the rate we were doing it before, the demand pressure against oil supply will continue to rise prices, and we'll short circuit at 147 to 50 a barrel and collapse back down again. It's a boomerang. It's over. It is an end game. And I've said to my colleagues, tell me how we get through that wall at 150 a barrel. This is really serious stuff. Fast forward, December 2009, Copenhagen. 194 heads of state come together to address the Entropy Bill for the industrial age. We spewed CO2 into the heavens for 2 centuries to build a great civilization with tremendous benefits for a small part of the human race. But now that spent CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide are blocking the atmosphere, and we just can't get enough of that sun's radiation, that heat, back off the earth. It's as simple and profound as that. That is the Entropy Bill. It's not a metaphor. Entropy is spent carbon, not available for us. So our world leaders come together in Copenhagen, and they have to address the greatest crisis that we've ever faced in our short sojourn on this planet. Our scientists in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their 4th assessment report in 2007. It was an eye-opener. I was in Paris. It was published in Paris. President Chirac asked me to come in and address where do we go from here. And the first thing that hit me is that I had it dead wrong for 30 years, actually. Some of you older folks might have remembered a book I wrote in 1980 called Entropy. It's the first book on climate change. I got it wrong. My colleagues got it wrong. We all got it wrong. When we heard the 4th assessment report, it came clear to us that we continued to underestimate the acceleration of climate change because we couldn't anticipate all the subtle feedback loops till after they kicked in. For example, if you take a look at the 3rd UN report in 2001, 6 years earlier, and compared to the 4th report, It's amazing. In the third report, our scientists said, according to their models, that the great glaciers on our mountain ranges might start disappearing in the early 22nd century. The fourth report, 2007, the glaciers are melting in the first half of this century, real time, right now, from the Alps to the Andes. This is not about skiing in Davos. 1 out of every 6 human beings on this planet lives downstream from those snow melts and relies on them totally for sanitation, irrigation, hygiene. How do we repopulate 1/6 of the population of the world in 30 or 40 years? And that's just the beginning of this. The third report said that we probably will see more intense hurricane activity in the Gulf of Mexico in the 22nd century. The fourth report, Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, we are on real-time climate change. We've doubled the intensity of hurricanes in 30 years. This is not academic. If you live in beach property, as you know, from Maine to Florida, you can't get insurance easily. And every day at the beginning of hurricane season, people have that Weather Channel on at 6 in the morning every day across the Gulf asking, is this the day that we have to go? The third report said, look to the Arctic. That's the early test warning system. We may see open waters for the first time early in the 22nd century. The fourth report, 2007, we've had open waters in the Arctic in August for the last 4 summers. You can kayak in the Arctic. And there was a big editorial in the New York Times about it yesterday saying this could be it. When people say this is just a seasonal shift, spare me. The Arctic has been encased in ice for millions of years. That's not seasonal. So our scientists say we may see a 3-degree rise in temperature Celsius in this century. It could go much higher. That's pretty optimistic now. But to give you perspective, if we only go up 3 degrees, that takes us back to the temperature on this planet 3 million years ago in the Pliocene. Different flora and fauna, different ecosystems. And really, it's all about the hydrologic cycle. This is what I wish Al Gore and others had talked about in the public discussion. Here's what's really going on. It's all about water. For every 1 degree Celsius that the temperature rises on this Earth, the atmosphere absorbs 7% more precipitation from the ground, just sucks it up. So what happens is the whole water cycle changes. More violent storms, longer periods of drought. That's happening all over the world. We've got 20 million people underwater in Pakistan. We've got a drought across Russia right now that's threatening world food prices. We're in real time. We are in real-time climate change. If we only go up 2 to 3 degrees, and now that's looking very, very doubtful we can keep it to that, our scientists say we will lose on the downside about 25% of all assessed species of life on the Earth, perhaps by the end of the century, and on the upside, 70% extinction by the end of this century. That's your century and your kids. And we need to be clear about what this means. We've had 5 waves of biological extinction on Earth in the last 450 million years. 5 wipeouts. Every time there was a mass extinction, it took 10 million years to recover the biodiversity we lost. As my wife says, we're not grasping the enormity of this moment. We are in deep sleep and denial. We may emotionally feel it on some level, intellectually, but we're not in crisis mode. We're not thinking as a species. We're not trying to save ourselves and our fellow creatures. I mentioned the feedback loops. To give you an idea, I'll just use one anecdote. In the fourth report, there was mention of the permafrost in Siberia could be an issue, but we had no studies. Since then, we have the studies. The Siberian subarctic is the size of Germany and France, and across the ground, I don't know if any of you have ever been there, it's all permafrost. Underneath that frost is a time bomb, the entire carbon deposits of the pre-ice age. Because Siberia, before the last ice age, was a teeming grassland, an open savanna of lush animal and plant life. When the temperature of the planet shifts, it does so very quickly. The shift in temperature between the last ice age and today occurred during the Younger Dryas level in less than 10 years, a third of the temperature shift. It comes quick. That happened back when Siberia became enveloped with ice. The ice is melting. And there's more carbon deposits underneath there than the entire rainforest of the world. And in the last year, the journal Nature and Science reported it's accelerating at 6 times the speed we thought 12 months ago. And on the seabeds, it's coming up methane, which is 22 times more potent than CO2. And if that cover goes, I don't know what to say. That's only one feedback loop. We are in deep trouble. So our world leaders show up in Copenhagen, and they couldn't close the deal. And it was humiliating and embarrassing. The President of the United States barging into a door to see if he can be seated with the Chinese, Brazilian, and Indian delegations, and they came out with no agreement. And now it's not even on the agenda of issues in the United States. It's still right up at top in the EU, but not here. So here's my question. Why were our business leaders not able to anticipate the shutdown of the second industrial revolution and still don't actually understand it? Why? Why were our government leaders unable to close a deal on climate change and sign a treaty, even though it's the greatest single challenge we've ever faced as a species? What's wrong with us? What's wrong with us? I think the issue lies deeper than just the inability to regulate a global market or our inability to come up with benchmarks for CO2 reduction. What I think is really happening here is our business leaders, our government leaders, and for that matter, the rest of us, we're living off old ideas about human nature, the meaning of the human journey, and what our relationships are to this planet. Ideas that were weaned 200 years ago during the Enlightenment, at the beginning of the market era and the nation-state era. Those ideas are increasingly dysfunctional and toxic. They're a disconnect for a human race that has to come together as a single family living in one biosphere with our fellow creatures on this earth. For 1,500 years, the church had the last say about human nature, and at least the church was very clear about this. The church said, you're born in sin, depraved. Those babies are born depraved. Salvation has to await the next world with Christ. End of story. At the beginning of the Enlightenment, as we moved into the nation-state and market era, the Enlightenment philosophers started to challenge that set of assumptions. John Locke, the great political philosopher of the Enlightenment, said, well, actually, little babies aren't born depraved. They're born blank slate, tabula rasa. What you put in them, you get out of them. Except, and he left a little bit of an opening, he said there is one predisposition biologically. That is, we have a predisposition to acquire property. Now, somebody should have caught him on that. I mean, that's just naughty. I mean, somebody should have gotten him on that one. Adam Smith, the great Scottish economist, who did write a very good book on moral sentiments, but his primary work, The Wealth of Nations, he said little babies are born with a drive to seek autonomy and to pursue self-interest. That's basic to our drive. Jeremy Bentham, post-Enlightenment philosopher, said actually little babies are born with a drive to seek pleasure over pain, and we are at the core a utilitarian creature. Charles Darwin said no, actually every creature on earth is born with a drive to reproduce themselves so they can survive. And then, of course, at the end of that century, Sigmund Freud said, no, actually little babies are born with an insatiable sexual appetite, and their whole life is about extinguishing libido. How many parents do we have here and grandparents? Glad you're reproducing here. Is this what that little baby is when they come out of the womb? Rational, calculating, detached, pursuing their material self-interest, craving autonomy, desiring utility, hell-bent on reproducing themselves, and completely preoccupied and obsessed with extinguishing their libido. I know, it's amusing if it weren't so sad. If that is actually who we are, we're likely doomed. I don't see any way that 6.8 billion people are going to come together as a global family and extend our family to understand we're part of an evolutionary family with our fellow creatures living on one biosphere, if that's who we are. Depraved, rational, calculating, detached, autonomous, pleasure-seeking, utilitarian-driven, libido-oriented. And that idea of human nature, that idea of human journey is embedded in our parenting, but more importantly, in every school model in the world today. We'll get back to that in the second part after the break. Let me take you to 1992, sleepy little laboratory in Parma, Italy. Nothing much going on. They were looking at macaque monkeys. They had a non-invasive technology. They put an MRI machine on the macaque monkey, and they were watching him try to open up a nut. And certain neurons lit up in the brain of that monkey. By sheer serendipity, and this is how science sometimes unfolds, accidents, a human being walks in the laboratory right after the experiment, unannounced. He sees the nuts. He's pretty hungry. He tries to open up a nut and eat it. The macaque monkey is absolutely nonplussed. Who's this alien invading my laboratory here? But he gazes at the human being, doesn't move, and then as the human being's opening the nut, the scientists see the MRI machine, the same exact neurons are lighting up when the macaque is observing the human open the nut as when the macaque monkey was trying to open up the nut. The scientists thought that the MRI machine had broken. They didn't know what they had. They then began putting MRI machine on other primates, then on humans, and they discovered mirror neurons. It's the first of a whole series of discoveries. And what they found is that human beings, some primates, we think elephants, dolphins, we're not sure, we haven't tested many creatures, are soft-wired with these neurons. And they allow one to experience another as if one was experiencing myself. So, for example, we know if a spider goes up your arm, I'm likely to feel a creepy feeling. Or if you puncture yourself and bleed, I'm likely to wince. We take this for granted, but that's distress. We call it empathic distress. What we are learning at the cutting edge of evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and child research development is that the human drive is quite different than what we have been taught over the last 200 years embedded in our school systems. We are discovering Homo empathicus. Let me give you some interesting experiments. We never knew what little babies were thinking because they couldn't talk. Now we know because there's some amazing experiments. There's thousands of them in the last 10 years from the Max Planck Institute to Yale. But let me give you one example from the Empathic Civilization, my book. Scientists put all these little babies on the floor. You know, they're about 9, 10 months, pre-verbal, still crawling. And they had a little wooden plank that goes up like this, and then they took a piece of wood and put 2 glued eyes on the wood, and the little piece of wood tried to get up the plank and fell down each time. Then they had another piece of wood with 2 glued eyes, and the second experiment, the second piece of wood helps the first piece of wood up the plank. The third experiment, the hinderer. Piece of wood, 2 glued eyes. Every time the first piece of wood tried to get up the plank, the hinderer pushed him back down so he couldn't make it up. Then they let the babies go. They all crawled to the helper. Nobody crawled to the hinderer. Why? How did they know to do that? It gets even more strange. The Max Planck Institute. They had a man who would, with little babies sitting on the floor watching them, pre-verbal, not even walking, and he would take clothes off a clothesline. And if he took them off and he tried to collect them and they fell, that was experiment 1. The second experiment, he dropped them on the floor. Then he took books, tried to collect them, they fell. Second experiment, he throws them on the floor. They let the babies go. They never crawl up to him if he forcefully pushed any of it on the floor, only when he needed help. How do they know to do that? What we are discovering is that little babies' primary drive is not to be autonomous, self-driven, depraved, utilitarian, pleasure-seeking, materialist-driven. The primary drive is social. We are a social animal. We are the most social animal. We have a very big neocortex. We seek attachment, companionship, affection, and intimacy, and we are actually soft-wired with an empathic drive. Whether that becomes a mature drive depends first on parenting and then on schooling. Everything else flows from that. Our business models, our governing models, our cultural ways of life. So those drives can be either repressed or nurtured. If they're repressed, the secondary drives come in with a vengeance. The narcissism, the materialism, the aggression, the violence, the bullying, whatever. How does empathy develop? If little babies are in a nursery and one baby cries, all the other little babies will cry in response. They just have no idea why they're crying. That's empathic distress. Around 2.5 years of age, a baby can self-identify in a mirror. They know, that's me. Your dog can't do it. I know you try to put your dog up there and your cat. They just, you can't understand. There's you, they can't get it, all right? But a baby can start self-identifying around 2.5. Then they know that if they're feeling something when they're with a playmate, they know that their feeling is because the playmate's feeling it and they're somehow experiencing it. Around 8 years of age, the individual develops to the point where they can have mature empathic response, because at that point the child learns about birth and death. It can be anywhere from 5 to 8, where they totally understand that they come from mommy and daddy, they have a one and only life, that every moment's fragile, that it's tough to be alive, whether you're a fox navigating the forest or a human being, and that every moment of our life is unrepeatable, and we have our own personal history. It's at that point where we are self-developed and we have an existential sense of our one and only life and our one and only history on this earth that we can begin to mature empathy through our schooling. Because then when we experience another being, it could be a human or your dog or a creature you come across in the forest, when we empathize, what's really happening is we have this, the width of death and the celebration of life combined. And that is, if I'm empathizing with you, I understand that you have a one and only life. I can feel your plight. You're struggling to flourish and be. It's tough being alive. We're both imperfect and fragile. And so I smell the death, I celebrate the life, and I try to show a little compassion and solidarity because we're all in this together, right? Isn't that what empathy is? So some people think, isn't the empathic civilization utopia? I'm always amused. It's the exact opposite of utopia. I can tell you there's no empathy in heaven. If you're planning on going there, I'll give you a pre-read on it. There's just absolutely no empathy in heaven because there's no mortality. There's no sense of an existential moment where we're alive and that every moment is unrepeatable. That's the whole basis of empathy, the social solidarity. There would be no empathy in utopia because everything is perfect. Does anyone here empathize with something that's perfect? We empathize with the fragilities, the frailties, and we show solidarity as a species. I like a civilization based on empathy because we don't seek a standard of perfection because we can never live up to that. So I asked myself the question, if we're soft-wired for empathy, is it possible to imagine extending empathic sensibility with the right schooling and parenting to the whole human race? Can we stretch the idea that we're part of a single family, one species, and even stretch it beyond that to extend to our evolutionary family, every creature on the planet, and begin to understand we live in one biosphere? Because if we can extend empathy to create global consciousness, biosphere consciousness actually, we may make it. If we can't, I don't see how we're going to survive. Now I look at all you young people here and I say, well, my God, what's it going to be for you and your kids and grandchildren? So now the question becomes, how does empathy develop over history? Well, we know consciousness changes over history. And the Raw School is all about how the evolution of consciousness in our education system. First experiment on K through 12 in the world on this. But how does consciousness change over history? We know the way we think, the way our brain's actually wired. You know, that little baby's brain is not connected, and those synapses start connecting from the time they're born, and you've got a lot of the connections by 4, and then another spurt during adolescence. By the time you're 19 men, it's all over for you. 28 women, it's all over for you. It's downhill after that, all right? So if consciousness, our consciousness is not the same as a medieval serf. Their consciousness is not the same as a forager hunter 20,000 years ago. How does consciousness change over history? The historians don't help us here. Some of the social historians do, but the historians don't. Because the historians chronicle pathology in history. If you're a student of history, what are the history books always talking about? War, violence, genocide, redressing social grievances, upheavals. Now, the reason we chronicle them historically is because they get our attention. Because they trigger fright. They give us a sense that something extraordinary is happening. That's the point. They're extraordinary. They're not what happens every day. But when we chronicle history as if that is our everyday experience, we get a very grim picture of the sojourn of the human race. I recall 30 years ago reading a little quote from Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher. He said, "Happiness are the blank pages of history. They're the periods of harmony." It's nice, huh? Well, it turns out there is another history. And when I wrote this book, I went back and I said, how do I find the other history? And it's captured, not by the historians, it's captured in the narratives. It's captured in the stories. You read about Gilgamesh here, right? It starts with Gilgamesh all the way through the novels, the cinemas of the 20th century. We have a record of the development of human consciousness in our narratives throughout history. And consciousness changes, and here I think is how consciousness changes. The great changes in consciousness that extend empathy to broader domains, that change the world around us, occur when two things happen. First, when human beings change the way we organize the energy of the earth. And we have changed the way we've organized energy on this planet many times. When we create new energy regimes, we create the opportunity of creating more complex civilizations, bringing more people together. When we create these opportunities with new energy regimes, the more complex civilizations, it requires a concomitant communication revolution to manage the new complexities we put together. When energy revolutions converge with communication revolutions, when they come together, those are the pivotal points in history. They change consciousness, they extend the empathic domain, they change, as our German friends would say, Gestalt, they change temporal spatial orientation. Let me give an example. And now I want you to think from here on in how we educate our young people. Forager hunters. 93% of our existence on this planet, we lived as forager hunters. The energy regime, of course, was plants and animals and the human body's ability to collect and occasionally hunt. And by the way, it's not hunters, foragers. It's foragers, hunters. We are not carnivores. We're not herbivores. We're omnivores, and hopefully we'll move toward herbivores as choice. But we're designed for lots of fruits and vegetables, occasional hunt, historically. So all forager and hunters, their energy regime was the plants and animals, and every one of these forager-hunter societies created language to organize socially their survival as well as their social life. Every single forager-hunter society in history, without exception, created mythological consciousness. Every single one. When we moved to the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations, big centralized agriculture, it changed again. Let me just say, by the way, every forager-hunter society, empathy extends, but only to blood ties. If you are the next tribe over on the next mountain, you are not the humans. You are the non-humans. When we go to the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations, consciousness changes again. Go to Sumeria, Mesopotamia. Do you read about Sumerians? I assume you do. So the Sumerians were the first to create these great centralized agricultural civilizations. Before that, there was a little garden pasturing, little pastoral, little small agriculture, garden agriculture. All of a sudden, they took people from their local little tribes and they indentured thousands of men to build these canals. Then they had to create craft skills to operate the mechanics of the dike system. They had to set up the royal granaries, the royal roads, the distribution systems, and urban life. This was a complex new energy regime, and the energy was stored grain, capturing the sun's photosynthesis in barley, wheat, and rye. That was the stored energy. It was so complicated, this new energy regime, that they had to create a new form of communication, organize it, and it was what? Cuneiform writing. And this is what's so fascinating. Everywhere we see the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations emerge, the Middle East, the Indus Valley in India, the Yangtze in China, and Mexico, independently, people create some form of writing to manage it. That's amazing. And when we went to the great hydraulic civilizations, we moved from mythological consciousness to theological consciousness. All the great religions were formed then. The Abrahamic religions, we are the people of the book. Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Buddhism, the script. And when we went to theological consciousness, empathy extended again. From blood ties to religious affiliations. Now we have a new fiction that one's family is one's religion. So all Jews now empathize with other Jews as extended family. It's a fiction. It's not based on blood. All Christians in first century Rome, they had come in from their local tribes. All of a sudden, they start calling each other brother and sister. Do you understand what a change in consciousness that is? That's a fictional family. They empathize. Muslims with Muslims. In the 19th century, we had another convergence of communication and energy. Print technology had been around since Gutenberg. Actually, the Chinese and Koreans had it even earlier, but they were stuck with ideograms. That phonetic alphabet really helped us leap ahead. But it played a social mission for centuries, the print press. Martin Luther used that print press the way our young kids, activists, use the internet. It was an organizing tool. Mass production of Bibles allowed each person to stand alone with their God, alone. And there was a great schism in Christianity, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the 30-Year War, the Peace of Westphalia. But the economic mission of the print press didn't become clear till the early 19th century when steam and coal technology was introduced into print with rotary and linotype technology. So we could mass produce print really quick, really cheap, really efficiently. Then we introduced public schools. From 1830 to 1880, we introduced public schools in Europe and America, and we created a print-literate workforce to organize the complexities of coal, steam, and rail, a new energy regime. We could never have organized coal, steam, and rail and national markets with codex and oral culture. It required print. And when we went to the first industrial revolution, consciousness shifted again from mythological to theological to ideological. Sense and sensibility, the Enlightenment. And with ideological consciousness, empathy extends again, this time to a new fictional family called one's nation state. There were no nation states before that. All of a sudden, all Germans start to think of themselves as Germans because the public school system created the idea that there was something called Germany. There was no Germany. Then created a common history, a philosophical and cultural framework, and then after years and years in that school system, you start to think, I'm German. I have certain celebrations I commemorate, certain historical events. Now all Germans empathize with Germans, but maybe not the Italians. They formed Italy in the 1870s, and the first prime minister of Piedmont, you know this, said, now that we've created Italy, we have to create Italians. And you know what I'm talking about here. We still haven't done that. Right, you know what I'm talking about. And so now Italians empathize with Italians, but maybe not the French. These are fictional families, but they extend empathy. In the 20th century, another convergence of communication energy, first-generation electricity, especially the telephone, became the command and control mechanism to manage the complexities of a new energy regime, oil, the internal combustion engine, and suburban rollout. That second industrial revolution gave rise to psychological consciousness. Mythological, theological, ideological, psychological. We think therapeutically here. Grandma doesn't. If my grandma was at the family table, Thanksgiving time, and I would see she was getting more agitated, more nervous, a little upset, and then all of a sudden I see that she throws a dish on the floor. I saw it. And I go up to Grandma, I said, that was a passive-aggressive act. There's obviously something troubling you from your childhood experience at Thanksgiving dinners. You're projecting and it's transferring this out. Let's talk about it. Let's have a cup of tea. Grandma does not have a clue as to what I'm talking about. Grandma can think, she can think ideologically, theologically, put some salt over the shoulder and think mythologically, but not therapeutically. This has everything to do with parenting. The shift from shaming cultures to guilt cultures. How does it work its way out in the school system? Got a lot of work to do. All right. So when we went to psychological consciousness, empathy starts to extend to people of like-minded affinity associations and interest. So here's my question. If consciousness is extended from mythological to theological to ideological to psychological, the younger generation may be dramaturgical right now, can we get to the next step of biosphere consciousness? Can we go from empathy based on blood ties to religious affiliation to national identity and now start to think of ourselves as part of a biosphere community? Is that a big leap? Why would we go backward? The problem is we're up against a time juggernaut. Because there is a contradiction at the heart of human history. It's a very bittersweet paradox. And that is that new, more complex energy regimes provide for more energy flow through. New communication revolutions manage it. We bring more diverse people together, and we become more cosmopolitan. We get to integrate empathy to broader domains. And we become more individualized, and empathy becomes the indivisible hand that allows each of us who are more individualized to show solidarity with each other in bigger fictional domains, religious, national. The paradox is those more complex societies use more energy, deplete the resources of the planet. Now we're in the possibility now of a globally connected world, at the speed of light. We've annihilated time and space. Our young people can Skype in classrooms around the world and see the other classroom in Tokyo as extended family or extended classrooms. And yet, we're now facing the possibility that the same civilization that brought us together in more connected ways, in more complex ways, is now possibly facing us with our own extinction because of climate change. That's the paradox, the empathy, entropy paradox in history. How do we break it? We are on the cusp of a third industrial revolution that could get us to biospheric consciousness in less than 2 generations. If we can rethink the parenting and rethink the schooling process, and we've got 25 years to get this right. We have a new convergence of communication energy. We've had a very powerful communication revolution in the last 15 years. The internet, personal computers. This second generation electricity communication is very different than the first. The first was centralized top-down communication. This new communication revolution is flat and open source. And that means anyone in this room and 3 billion other people can take a little utensil, a BlackBerry or iPhone in the palm of their hand and send their own video, audio, and text to 2 or 3 billion other people at the same time. And here's the key word, in a distributed fashion. This is the word that gets us through to a new industrial revolution and a new educational revolution. The new technologies are, by their nature, the communication technology is not centralized, patriarchal, and top-down. They're distributed, collaborative, open source. Distributed, collaborative, open source. This distributed, collaborative internet revolution is just now beginning to converge with a new energy regime. Distributed communication to manage distributed energy. When distributed IT communication technology manages distributed energies, we have a powerful third industrial revolution that maybe can get us to biospheric consciousness, maybe in time. What are distributed energies? Well, let's compare them to elite energies, which we're familiar with. Elite energies are elite simply because they're not in the backyard. Go home today, chances are pretty good you do not have coal, oil, natural gas, and uranium in your backyard. These energies are only found in certain locations in the world. So they require a completely different management style. They require huge military investments to secure them, huge geopolitical investments to maintain access to them, massive capital flows to get them from the under the ground to your home. This fossil fuel and uranium energy regime is the most centralized top-down energy regime we have ever created in history. And I don't have to remind us how many millions and millions of people have died in wars to secure coal, oil, gas, and uranium. That's the dark underside of this great short-lived civilization we've been in. Now, those energies are sunsetting. Does anyone think that oil, coal, gas, and uranium are sunrise energies? Their S-curve is exhausted. And all the technologies of the 21st century that were based on those energies, like the internal combustion engine, are old. There's no multiplier effect. And the whole infrastructure embedded with these energies is now on life support. How do we regrow a global economy with an energy regime that's sunsetting, technologies that have exhausted their multiplier effect, and an infrastructure that's on life support? It's not about pouring money into rebuilding the roads. We have to create a new infrastructure. And what I'm going to outline to you tonight, this morning, is a third industrial revolution infrastructure that we are laying down in Europe. Distributed energies. The sun shines every day. The wind blows around the planet every day. We have geothermal heat under the ground, hot core of the planet. Garbage can be recycled energy. Rural areas, we have agricultural and forestry waste. On the oceans, we have the tides and the waves coming in and out. Small hydro. These are distributed. The reason we call them distributed, these renewable energies, they're found in every single square foot of this world, ocean and land, in some proportion and some frequency. The EU has committed itself to a 5-pillar infrastructure to lay down a third industrial revolution. I was privileged to develop this economic game plan for the EU. It was formally endorsed by the Parliament in 2007. We're now implementing across the 27 member states now. I want you to think about this and then keep thinking about how does this relate to the way we teach our young people. I'm going to lay out a collaborative, distributed, and third industrial revolution model. Pillar 1, the EU has committed itself to 20% renewable energies by 2020. That's a third of the electricity in Europe. This is not a benchmark, a mandate, way ahead of the US and anywhere else. Now, that's pillar 1, but then we face pillar 2. How do we collect this distributed renewable energy? At first, our thoughts were, oh, well, that's easy. Where do we have all the sun? Italy, Greece, the Mediterranean. Let's go get these big solar parks out there and then ship it back in a big high voltage line. The Irish seem to have a lot of wind off that coast. Let's go harness it, put a cable under the channel, and ship it across Europe. The Norwegians have a lot of hydro. Let's harness it and send it on its merry way across the EU. Now, I don't oppose centralized solar and wind. They're transitional, though. They're not the third industrial revolution. They are only a small transition on the road to where we want to go. And the reason is this. We began to ask the question, and this is a simple but profound question. We didn't even begin to ask it until 3.5 years ago. If renewable energy is distributed and found literally in every square foot of the world, why would we only collect it in a few central points? That was 20th century thinking based on fossil fuels and uranium and centralized, top-down organization. Let me say that the energy regime determines all the organizational models in society. Show me a centralized energy regime, I'll show you patriarchal family, I'll show you educational systems modeled along the same way, and government. So, pillar 2, we began to understand it's all about buildings, buildings, buildings. The number 1 cause of climate change, at least up to now we believe that, is buildings. They use most of the energy, 40% of the CO2. Does anyone know what the second cause of climate change is? Buildings are number 1. Well, that's interesting you say that, because 3 years ago, during Chancellor Merkel's presidency, I had an opportunity, we had all the environmental ministers in a room, and I said, what's the number 2 cause? And everyone said transport, and this is among the most educated ministers in the world. Actually, number 2 is beef production and consumption. Number 3 is transport. And now we think number 2 is heading to number 1. But isn't it interesting? Beef, I wrote a book on it called Beyond Beef back in 1990, and the cattle industry went ballistic and said, Mr. Rifkin, you're over the top. But methane production, the use of feed grains, really is a major cause of climate change. But not one government leader in 194 countries, including the ones I advise, has made a single statement on the number 2 cause of climate change, including Al Gore, who I deeply respect. But if we can't even address the number 2 cause of climate change for fear that people will be upset, how are we going to make it? We have to move radically down that food chain really quickly. Really, really quickly. So anyway, buildings. Buildings. We have 191 million buildings in the European Union, and we envision converting every single building that exists in the EU to a mini power plant over the next 30 years. Converting them to a little solar on the roof, vertical wind on the wall, heat pump under the ground, etc. We see this as stimulating a construction boom, because the elephant in the room, if you want to move an economy, is always construction. When energy and communication revolutions come together, they change consciousness, they change temporal spatial orientation, they change dwelling habitats. Foragers and hunters, their temporal spatial habitat was these rhythms and periodicities of the changing seasons. Their habitat was nomadic to go with those rhythms. In the great hydraulic agricultural civilization, we built the first urban enclaves. They were theologically built enclaves. In the first industrial revolution in the 19th century, when we went to stored sun, we started creating these big, dense, centralized vertical cities, New York, London. We moved to the sky. When we went to the second industrial revolution, oil and the automobile and the interstates, we went to suburban construction. We actually decentralized buildings that even then more centralized the control over them. As we go to a third industrial revolution, our buildings now become dual purpose. They're our dwellings and they are our power plants. Think mainframe computer, now you've got your own desktop computer. Big boom in construction, millions of jobs. The new buildings are positive power. In Europe, we have the first buildings up that create more energy than they need. We have an old building. The GM factory in Spain, Aragon, Spain, biggest opal factory in the world. GM hooked up with Veolia, the French company, and Clairvoyant, an American company. They slapped a solar photovoltaic across that roof of that factory. It only took them 50 days to do it. $78 million. That photovoltaic roof creates enough electricity to power 4,700 homes. That's just one roof. Bouygues, the great construction company in Paris, has a new office complex going up. It's so architecturally sophisticated, it sucks so much energy up from around the building, it creates more power than it needs and can send back to the grid. We got the buildings up. There's a zero-emission building, just came up, a high school, middle school in Connecticut. Local contractors. So pillar one, we go to renewable energies, they're distributed. Pillar two, we convert our building stock to mini power plants. And we appreciate the real estate value of the world. Pillar three, and this is a real problem we face, how do we store this energy? Because the sun isn't always shining. The wind isn't always blowing. Sometimes it's blowing at night and you need the electricity during the day. These are intermittent energies. So in 2003, when Romano Prodi was president of the commission, we sat down, I advised him, I said, Romano, we got a real problem here. Because if we're going to go to 20% renewables, a third of our electricity renewable by 2020, let me paint you a scenario. We wake up in the summer of 2020, a third of the electricity is from renewable energy, and guess what happens? It's a hot summer, but we get cloud cover across Europe for 2 weeks. The wind stops blowing, really bad luck. And to top it all off, the water tables are down for hydroelectricity because of climate change drought. What do we do? Romano is a very understated, mature political leader. He simply said, that's a very interesting point. Now, usually when politicians say that, it means they're not doing anything. For him, former economist, professor, that means he's going to do something. So I was wondering, well, what's he going to do? 60 days later, €2 billion research and development plan to create hydrogen to store these renewable energies. Manuel Barroso, we now advise now, he's just set up an €8 billion deployment so that hydrogen storage will be placed across every building and infrastructure across the EU. We're in favor of all sorts of storages. There you can do water pumping and flow batteries and capacitors and flywheels, but we think hydrogen is universal. It's the basic element of the universe. It's the stuff of the stars. Our astronauts have been circling this Earth for 30 years, and those spaceships are powered by hydrogen fuel cells. Time to take that technology back here to Long Island. So here's how it works. When the sun hits your roof, solar collectors, you get a little electricity. If you don't need some of it immediately, you electrolyze water. If you've done this in your high school chemistry, you put the anode and the cathode in the water, the hydrogen bubbles up to the surface, goes into the tank. And then when the sun isn't hitting your roof, you simply convert the hydrogen back to electricity. Yes, it's an energy loss, but that's the first and second law of thermodynamics. Whenever you convert energy, you lose energy. If we actually stop to look at the loss in energy conversion and getting coal, oil, gas, and uranium to you at every step, it's through the roof compared to this little process I just talked about. Pillar one, renewable energy. Pillar two, our buildings become converted to our own power plants. Three, we store that energy in the form of hydrogen. Then pillar four, there are 5 pillars actually. Pillar four, this is where the communication revolution comes together with that energy revolution to create new economy, new consciousness. We take the same technology that created the internet. It's identical. We take the transmission grid of Europe, America, Africa, Asia, and we take that whole transmission grid and we turn it into an internet for energy using the exact same technologies you use now every day. So that when millions and millions and millions of buildings are collecting their energy on site, the sun, the wind, the heat, storing it with hydrogen like you store media in digital, then what they don't need, those millions of buildings can share it across smart distributed utility networks across entire continents. Just like we now create our own information, store it in digital, share it peer-to-peer and on the internet. This is a third industrial revolution. The 5th pillar is coming online in the next 6 months. Plug-in electric vehicles are coming in December, the Chevy Volt, the Nissan Leaf, all the companies. Hydrogen fuel cell cars are coming in 36 months. They're already in the production schedule, Daimler and other companies. So what's happening is the power and utility companies who were always connected at the hip to the big oil companies are now beginning to change their alliances. Because as the electric cars come in and fuel cell cars, the power and utility companies have to set up little power charging units, millions of them, across countries. So that when you power up your vehicles, your buses, your trucks, your cars, in your buildings, Then at any given time on the road, you may want to stop at a parking garage or a meter. There has to be a power charger. So the car can connect back to the grid and get electricity, or the software on your little computer will say, sell yours back to the grid because the price is right. If 25% of your fleet at any given time is stopped and selling back to the grid, you eliminate every centralized power plant in the world. This is distributed capitalism. It's based on distributed collaborative ideas. It's both a hybrid. It's in some ways beyond capitalism and socialism. It's a hybrid. It requires millions of entrepreneurs who take their own personal responsibility for their part of the biosphere, but we have to share our energy collaboratively across continents in order for us to become part of one family that can survive. On the internet, young people don't say I'm right-wing, I'm left-wing. They're individualized, but they're also collaborating in social spaces. Apparently, they didn't read Garrett Hardin's essay. Garrett Hardin in the 1960s, an ecologist, wrote an essay, said the commons will never work. If everybody's sharing on the commons, the freeloaders will take over, the selfish people will rule. Lord of the Flies, you all read the book. Well, apparently, hundreds of millions of young people didn't read Garrett Hardin's essay because they're all collaborating in open social spaces like Wikipedia and YouTube and Linux on these sites. That's a collaborative and distributed world. The schools have not caught up to a collaborative and distributive curricula. So, renewable energies, building as power plants, hydrogen storage, distributed utility networks, so we share energy across continents, plug-in electric vehicles, power to the people. The reason we can do this is something called grid IT. For 30 years, governments would say, Mr. Rifkin, please, let's get serious. How do you expect to run a global economy on solar roofs and windmills? I mean, come on. We like them, our kids like them, we'll have some. They're benign, they're good. You can't run a global economy on windmills and garbage and agricultural waste, and it can't be done. For 30 years, we couldn't answer this question. We knew that the existing fossil fuels and uranium were finite, polluting, and we're going to run out. We knew that distributed renewable energies are here until the sun burns out. But we could not address this issue until 10 years ago when the software industry in California created Grid IT, ITTO. It's the revolution in IT, where all the companies are going. We now have software that allows us to connect hundreds of thousands or millions of desktop computers that don't have a lot of power. But when you connect them with the software, the distributed power exceeds by a magnitude anything you can imagine with centralized supercomputers. We can take grid IT to energy now. When millions and millions and millions of buildings are producing just a little bit of surplus they don't need, storing it in hydrogen, then sharing across continents, the distributed power exceeds anything you can ever imagine with these old-fashioned, outdated, coal nuclear power plants. The music companies did not understand distributed power. Apparently, young people, and here we have the group here, some of you, apparently young people have nothing else to do after school but find new ways to create software to get the music for free. You cannot defeat millions and millions and millions of 12-year-olds who have nothing else to do after school. And the third industrial revolution sweeps energy across continents. Just like information likes to run free on the internet, distributed energies like to run across contiguous land masses that end at continental borders. That's why we're going to have continental unions everywhere. The EU is the first. The Asian Union's now forming. The African Union's forming. The South American Union's forming. NAFTA was a false start. Hopefully we'll get something better. And this is the beginning of a shift from geopolitics to biosphere politics. This creates global consciousness. More importantly, it's actually biosphere consciousness. Let's be very clear about this. Global consciousness, I use that, but it's really biosphere consciousness. When every one of us is responsible in our local energy cooperatives in our neighborhood, small businesses, neighborhood residential groups, condo associations, when we're responsible for our part of the biosphere, our little swath, stewarding that energy and the photosynthesis from that, but then we have to share that energy with everyone else across whole continents, we start to become aware in a very real way, not academic, that we are as connected in the energy flows that make up the ecosystems of the biosphere as we are connected in the blogosphere across the internet. That's what happens when distributed communication and energy come together. That's biosphere consciousness. Now, how do we get there? So here we are in a crisis moment. Time is running out. We got this old guy up here talking about biospheric consciousness, and we're going to bring together communication energy. Can we do this quick enough is going through your minds, because here's the cutting-edge teachers of this revolution. Can we get there quick enough? Consciousness changes very quickly when energy and communication revolutions change temporal spatial orientation. I'll give you an example. How many of you looked in the mirror this morning? Okay. Now, you looked in that mirror this morning, you take that for granted. Do you know that for most of history, up until the 1400s, people didn't see themselves? They may have saw themselves in a pool of water, whoa, or in a piece of metal, blurry, but they really didn't see themselves. Grooming habits were pretty poor. In the 1400s, in Murano, off Venice, they began to mass produce small mirrors, reflecting mirrors. This became a new pastime for the human race. All of a sudden, people started looking, hey, look at that. That's me. You, me. This wasn't about narcissism. I want to give you an idea of how technology changes consciousness quickly. All of a sudden, I can identify how unique I am compared to you. I am so different than you. But then when I see you, I realize how similar you are to me. This is why we call this self-reflection. Mirrors. We began to internalize and create even a deeper sense of our individuality and selfhood, but at the same time, an understanding of how close we are to our fellow humans and our fellow creatures, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the tongues, etc. Let me skip up. When the Apollo made its last flight around the dark side of the moon, our boys came out on the light side, the astronauts. The sun was shining on the Earth, gorgeous, and they took a couple amateur photos of the planet. Some of you aren't old enough to remember, but Time Magazine, Life, all put these photos on the front cover, and then we plastered the posters on our walls. This was an out-of-body experience. For the first time, the human race saw the world from the outside in, from the top down. It was an out-of-body experience. It was a change in temporal spatial orientation. Every young person in this school does this every day. Let's say you're Skyping. Do you do any Skyping with classrooms in other countries? Let's say you're Skyping with a classroom in Tokyo, and two 12-year-olds meet each other on the Skype classroom, and they're going to do a homework assignment together. So the one here at the Ross School says, well, let me check this out. They go up on a Google map at night. They get the address of the other kid. They zoom down from outer space right to that kid's house, neighborhood, and they know exactly where they're located. That's an out-of-body experience, but it's now wired in the brain. We're looking from the outside in, from the top down, and with communication technologies interconnected around the world. When people say, how do you get biospheric consciousness? Every schoolroom in the world is already teaching it. They just don't know, and it's a good thing they don't know, because probably the school boards would probably take it out of the schools. But here's what's happening, especially, well, we won't mention specific states. There's always hope. So, what happens today? We can check this out. Every school child is learning that every single thing they do, the electricity they use, the family car they drive, the food they eat, the clothes they wear, comes with an ecological and carbon footprint, and that it intimately affects some other family or some other creature's ability to survive somewhere else on the planet, correct? You're seeing it in all the public schools, not just the private schools. That's biosphere consciousness. When the earthquake hit Haiti, you know, the Portuguese earthquake in the 1700s, it was hard to empathize with the immediacy of the moment because no one knew about it for a year. When that earthquake hit Haiti, the Twitters came out in 30 minutes, and I'm sure some of you were on YouTube in an hour, and within 2 hours, a whole younger generation was there in the backyard because those YouTubes are so visceral, they're so real, you're there. This isn't an academic exercise. Massive empathic embrace. What hit me was the protest in Tehran. After the flawed elections, to be charitable, the flawed elections, the young college students took to the streets, and you recall there was one young college woman, pre-med student named Nadia. Someone was videoing her on a cell phone, and she was gunned down. And that video went up in 60 minutes, and within 2 hours, every young person in the world had her Facebook, knew all about her, her family, and there was a deep empathic embrace of those students on those streets. That's biosphere consciousness. What we need to do now is we need to rethink our parenting and educational system so that it comports with the kind of mind we'd like to have in the 21st century. We will do that after the break. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. Sometimes, you know, we live by narratives. We live by stories. We don't live by objective data. That's vocational stuff. We live by stories. Let me tell you a story. Is anybody here taking their National Geographic DNA migratory test? Nobody? That's amazing. All right, usually a few people. Now you go up to the National Geographic website, you give them $100, they send you a kit. Now, you take DNA out of your cheek, my wife and I and my in-laws did it, and you put it in the little tube, send it back to the genetics laboratory at the National Geographic. They analyze your DNA, then they send back your response, and based on my DNA, they can tell me or my wife or my in-laws where I came from and where we came from on migratory patterns all the way through the beginning of history. Isn't that wild? Yeah. I'm going to save you $100. Because there's something more important in these test results that you need to know. Apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently 175,000 years ago in the Rift Valley of Africa, there were about 10,000 anatomically modern human beings walking those grasslands. Our geneticists located one woman. She's a database line. They call her the mitochondrial DNA Eve. Apparently, her genes passed to everyone in this room today. The other ladies didn't make it. It gets even more strange. I think it was about 70,000 years ago. They located a male, a database line. They call him the Y chromosome Adam, apparently a fairly potent gentleman. His genes passed to everybody in this room and all over the world. The other men didn't make it. We all came from two people. The Bible got this one right. We all came from two people. It could have been 4, it could have been 8. But what I'm saying is here we are in all our divisions. We're at various layers of consciousness. We have people that are still in mythological consciousness, tribal blood ties. We have people on the earth that are in theological consciousness, people that are in ideological consciousness, psychological consciousness, dramaturgical consciousness. We don't give up any of those. But they have to be integrated in a larger whole. There's nothing wrong with empathizing with one's blood ties or one's spiritual affiliations or one's geographic identities. But that doesn't preclude identifying as a common species in one biosphere with our fellow creatures. The task at hand in education is bringing all those consciousness and integrating them to a larger whole where we don't lose our sense of our past, but we create a more integrated whole so we can actually feel as if we're part of this mystery called life. I have no wisdom to impart on you at my age, at 65. As my wife says, I know less and less as I get older. The only thing I actually know as I get older is two things. One, when you get my age and we look back at life, we understand the important moments. We don't need the monkeys to tell us about mirror neurons. When we are very young, little babies, and we scamper up to help that man collect the clothes, we know what empathy is in a very non-individuated way. When we're very old and we look back at our life, we don't say the important moment. I closed a deal. I made some money. I had a utilitarian moment. I felt like an island to myself. I experienced my libido. We don't do that. When we look back, the moments that are photographed in our memory are the moments where we had an empathic experience, and it's usually spontaneous, where we could reach out from ourselves and I could transcend myself for maybe just a moment and literally experience another as if that other being, human or animal, was experiencing me. That's the ultimate democratization experience. That's what breaks down hierarchies and patriarchies. Empathy is the ultimate democratic experience because I have to experience the other as if they were just like me. So what we need to do now is we need to begin to understand the importance of this to our life. And secondly, I'll leave you with this. You know, we've been sending out these TV and radio shows to the whole universe, trying to see if there's life out there. I guess it's pretty rough sending Leave It to Beaver shows to the universe and hoping someone's going to call us back. But nobody's calling us back. Maybe they're really smart and don't want to have anything to do with us. But what I'm suggesting here is here we are in desperate search for sentient, intelligent, caring life when all around us we're annihilating our fellow creatures and ourselves right here on this planet. We haven't even begun to explore the mysteries of life on this earth. As E.O. Wilson says, we have a biophilia connection, but we're losing it. It is always interesting to me that the most often used word among young people today is what? No. What's the word after every sentence? No. There's another one now beside like. I'm going to give you both. No. That's like, whatever, and then if they really want to exclaim something, you said something interesting, they'll say, awesome. Awesome. You don't do that to Roscoe? Awesome. Now, why is it we say like, whatever, and awesome? Are we broadening our vision or narrowing our consciousness? Like means simulation. I can't really feel that I'm here. Whatever means ennui, been there, done that. And then awesome implies, when you use it over and over, that we are no longer awestruck. If our whole world is that computer screen, we miniaturize awe to awesome. And so there may be a desperate plea for a younger generation that keeps saying like, whatever, awesome, to try to broaden consciousness and reconnect with life instead of miniaturizing. Awe requires that we have this basic feeling about the mysteries of the universe, and my God, what is this? What is this person here, this hand? I touch this, what does this mean? And it's all the cells in your body are going to be coming and going every 7 years. How does you as a pattern stay there in 7 years from now when every single cell leaves you? We have no clue, so the geneticists don't talk about it. What is life? What is existence? Awe is that feeling that life is something and existence is something so incredible that we're struck by it. And without awe, we can't wonder. If you have someone that has no awe, there's no sense of wonder, because awe is about the mysteries of life. Without wonder, we can't have imagination. Imagination requires awe, wonder requires awe. And imagination is triggered by empathy. Empathy is imagining the other as if the other was us, an experience, a moment, another being. So what we need to do is bring a deep spirituality back to consciousness and reclaim awe, wonder, imagination, and let empathy flow through our parenting and our school process. The mission here for this school, you are very privileged, extremely privileged. The teachers in this school, you're trying to do something that's never been done before. That takes on a huge responsibility. You're trying to actually prepare young people for biospheric consciousness. You're trying to prepare young people to understand that the first mission of education is how we connect with the awe of life and our fellow humans on this planet. You're trying to create the possibilities of a generation who can heal the planet, restore the earth, save our species. And it's an awesome responsibility for this reason. There are very few flagship projects out there. There are very few lighthouse projects out there. And after the break, we're going to talk about rethinking the educational system. But if projects like this don't succeed, we're not going to make it. What we have to do is make sure we deepen this project, extend this project, even think even more broadly about what curriculum and pedagogy should be, and then open source it to the world. So that in one generation, we can move ahead. And remember, we created public schooling in less than 50 years and literacy across the planet. If we could do that in the 19th century with that limited communication and mobility, there is no reason we cannot create a new biosphere consciousness, rethink our schooling system in the next 2 generations. The mission begins here in this school. Thank you. It really is all about the educational system. We need to be pretty clear. The Enlightenment philosophy didn't become some arcane discussion in the academic community. We embedded it in the public school systems of the world. Think about the framework. Remember our philosophers back then. Of course, the Enlightenment was mixed. There was quite a bit of folks that talked about sensibility. There was the counter-Enlightenment, et cetera. But we basically ensconced a certain set of ideas in that school system. And they were based on the idea that our basic nature is to be autonomous, to be utilitarian, to be fairly rational, to be detached, to be objective, to be utilitarian. And if you take a look at the school system, grade 1, the first thing that student learns, they learn everything they need to do as soon as they show up. As soon as they show up, they understand exactly what's expected of them. Number 1, they show up, and the authority goes from the top down, from the teacher to the individual student. The teacher's up front, the students are in the classroom. There is authority top down. It's centralized from the get-go. Number 2, the students are taught that knowledge is power and something that you personally acquire in a competitive struggle with others. Point 3, the students are taught that sharing is cheating. Because each student is supposed to be isolated with a personal relationship with a teacher, but the students aren't supposed to be lateral, distributed, and sharing their ideas with each other. That's cheating. And number 4, the students are taught to be efficient. Because if they're efficient, you can have step 5, and that is to turn out productive citizens. Do I have this? We have to break that mode, because if we're talking about human nature as empathic and that we seek intimacy, companionship, and we seek sociability, and that's our basic drive, how do we create an educational system that goes with that? Let me start with parenting first and then go to the educational system very quick. People will say, well, how does parenting affect this? Half the human race is still in a shaming culture in parenting, and half the human race is in a therapeutic culture in parenting. Empathic changes have been very quick with psychological consciousness. In my grandmother's generation, if a little toddler acted up and took another toddler's toy and the other toddler started to cry, the mother would slap the kid and say, "Shame on you, naughty boy." That gives the sense to that child that they're not living up to a standard of perfection, that love is conditional, and if they're a bad person, they're isolated. And if you raise a child like that in a shaming culture, you'll either get a withdrawn child or a violent child in some grades of separation. It's the same with a dog. If a dog is abused, neglected, treated in that fashion, you'll get either a withdrawn or an aggressive dog. Today, a therapeutic parent, they don't even know they're therapists. It's just it's psychological consciousness. If their child takes another child's little toy, the parent will take their child apart and say, "Look at little Johnny crying over there. How would you feel if Johnny took your toy?" That's empathic extension. Why don't you go up to Johnny? Your little kid goes up to Johnny. Johnny's crying. Your little kid starts empathic distress, tears everywhere. Then you provide him a script or her a script saying, "Well, what can you do for Johnny?" And your kid will think about giving a toy back to Johnny. That's a guilt parenting based on the idea that we expect that our child wants to do the right thing, that we are by nature a social creature, that we show solidarity with each other, but they need the scripts in order to mature their sense of self-development in relationship to the other. We have to take that script then into the school system. A school system that's top-down, patriarchal, centralized, in which performance is measured by standardized responses and recitation to something that's already given, it doesn't work. Now, from what I gather at the Ross School is very, very interesting, and I'll say this, I think the Ross School has many of these elements, but maybe not all of them yet, but way ahead of everybody else. What we need to do now is move from a patriarchal, centralized, top-down model that fit the elite energies and organizing models of the first and second industrial revolution, because that educational model did prepare people to go into the factories, into the offices, take orders, be engaged in Frederick Taylor's principles of scientific management, have a top-down organizational chart, be productive like a machine. We prepared them with that school system model. But as we move into a 21st century society, we have to create the idea that we are part of a human race, we're part of an extended evolutionary family, and we live in a biosphere community. That requires a different approach to education, what we would call distributed and collaborative. And there are bits and pieces of this pedagogy beginning to develop in various projects around the world. For example, empathic curriculum, very different than self-esteem curriculum. Show up, I'm great, I'm over-empowered, and that just creates a narcissism. Now, self-esteem is good if it's in the context of being engaged with others in an embodied way in order to create a compassionate kid. But just saying, I'm great and here are the ways why, in a vacuum without experience, creates a narcissistic personality trait. Empathic curriculum is beginning to develop. I know that you know about Mary Gordon's program in Canada. Have you taught that here? I mean, do the teachers know the Mary Gordon program? I'll give you one example. Thousands of kids from K through 12 and high school young people go through an empathic curriculum, the roots of empathy, all across Canada. Thousands. What they do is they bring in a mother and her baby, 5-month-old baby, once a month. The students do this in first and second grade, then middle school, and then once before high school. Again, and they have 1 year with the mother and baby in the classroom. They're prepped ahead of time on how they have to be mindful to watch the interaction each month for a year with that mother and baby. And that is how they interact, how they create bonds of attachment, object relations theory, how they create bonds of attachment, how they communicate in a pre-verbal way, how they play and groom. And so they're actually asking them to go back to basics. And then they are prepared to ask questions and observe, like let's say the little baby's trying to stand up and falls over. Maybe the 8-year-old says, you know, that's what happens to me on my bike. I know exactly how that baby's feeling when I was learning to ride a bike. They began to identify and empathize with that relationship. And then they bring it back to pedagogy and curriculum, whether it's writing essays or whether it's social studies or whatever. There was one experience that was quite interesting. They had a 13-year-old boy who saw his mother killed in front of him when he was 4, was in foster homes after that, very violent, very withdrawn, very aggressive, and 2 years older than the other kids, a big menacing Hulk in the classroom. So they had, in one experience, there are thousands of these stories, they were in the classroom, he never talks, everyone was scared of him. At the end of the session, the mother said that her baby in the little snuggly never snuggled to the breast, but always wanted to be outward, would hurt the mother's feelings. So at the end of the class, he came up and he said to the teacher and mother, could I hold the baby? And everybody was just frightened to death. That's a moment of decision for a teacher, you know. And they said yes. He puts the baby snugly on him, and the baby for the first time goes directly to the heart and chest and snuggles. Now, didn't do it with his own mom. Maybe the baby sensed something. He went over to the side of the room and rocked back and forth in a chair with the baby. First contact of an empathic nature. He walked back afterwards, gave the baby back to the mother, and he asked the teacher and mother, if you've never been loved, does that mean you could not be a loving father? They've done critical analysis of this program, peer-reviewed, and all the critical thinking skills go up because they learn attention, mindfulness, no ADHD. They have to be observant. They have to see different points of view as the other students taught to talk about the relationships. They have to learn to live in an ambiguous world. All of that creates an empathic frame. There's an experiment in Chicago with Alzheimer experiment where they're taking kids from the poorest neighborhoods of the south side of Chicago, really poor, and they're teaming them up with Alzheimer's seniors in a very controlled environment. And what they're beginning to see is a tremendous sense of responsibility for someone who's fragile and vulnerable and needs their help. So the empathic curriculum is one part of this idea of a distributed collaborative education system. You are already doing Skyping. Skyping teaches those students that the classroom is not static and walled, it's porous, and the classroom's the world. So the more we Skype, and this is the way they use the medium, I think the more our students learn that their educational family is distributed and they collaborate across the world in real time. And they began to become much more cosmopolitan in a very immediate, dramatic way with other cultures and other points of view and other frameworks. Because that young person in Tokyo may have a lot of difference of opinion because of their parenting, et cetera, than the student here at Ross. So that distributes and collaborates. Another program that's essential is to ratchet up service learning to pedagogy. This is a revolution in the United States. It has not caught on yet elsewhere. We're going to move it to the EU. And that is, in less than 15 years, millions and millions of high school students have to, for graduation, participate in some community service in a food kitchen or a crisis center. But up to now, it's had some amazing results. Some kids use it, let's be frank, just so it looks good on the resume so they can get in a good college. Other kids couldn't care less. But there are millions of kids who have had transformational experiences in terms of their life because for the first time, they're not in a classroom just reciting back like a machine. They actually have to take responsibility for a distributed collaborative relationship with another human or another being, and they have to actually use their mind. It's not recitation, it's narrative. it's conversation, it's communication. The next step here is to move service learning to pedagogy. Some schools, colleges, high schools, they do essays and English lit, but there's no reason why the classroom can't be in the community. Social studies, cultural anthropology, math for sure, science, environmental. You could go to an environmental place, an arboretum, go into a civic organization. All of these require a different type of teacher, though. That teacher then has to be able to take her formal education and match it with the informal education of the persons responsible for the non-for-profit organization. Two different educational models. And this is very difficult after you've had your teaching certificate for some teachers to relax and say, here's what I can bring to the informal educator, here's what she can bring to me, so we create a common pedagogy. So a student learns that education is not abstract, but it's the way to actually connect people as a social animal and create broader domains of empathic regard. Pedagogy is the next step for service learning. Absolutely has to be done. Some schools are doing it. You know, Ira Harkavy and others have been working on this for years. Next, and this is the most difficult, distributed collaborative school teaching. This is where it gets really tough. As long as that teacher is in a traditional mode with that student, where the teacher is the authority, what that teacher is imparting is the knowledge, and the students, even if they're not reciting but are gradually manipulated to the teacher's point of view in order to pass the exam, everything else is lost here. Now, that doesn't mean that a teacher is just there and everybody does their thing, because the teacher has to create a structured environment, a very structured environment, as you know, in which certain rules are there, certain expectations are there, that they're there to learn, they're there to share knowledge, and then within that very structured environment, how do we create a classroom where there can be playfulness? Because all learning is really based on deep play. Every young person knows that when they are out after a movie and they're talking about what the movie really meant, and they're creating with each other and arguing with each other, and they're having a great time because they realize that knowledge is not something you take to yourself, it's shared between people. They really understand it. Same in collaborating on the internet. So how do we create that approach in the classroom? In business, we already break down groups into smaller groups that are then responsible for their own expertise. We do it in, the way this distributed collaborative education first happened very quickly is a guy named Abercrombie, who was a doctor at the London hospital. In the old days, each individual intern would come with a doctor, diagnose a patient. Then, at one time, he just had a problem with not getting all the interns together in time, so he brought them all to the bed, 7 of them at a time. And you've been in this experience, you've been in the hospital, 7 peering eyes at you. When they brought 7 interns in, and they all were adding to each other's conversation, critiquing it, amplifying, discounting it, they came to a quicker consensus about the right diagnosis of the parent, the wisdom of crowds. And then, of course, there was the professor at the University of Southern California that noticed that his Asian students did very well in class. The Hispanic and African Americans did not do as well. So he couldn't figure out why. He's a math professor. So he literally followed the Asian students first, and he found out afterwards they're all meeting with each other, talking, conversing, helping each other. We used to call it cheating. They're sharing their knowledge. Cheating is what we called it. The African-American Hispanic kids would usually go off into their own thing and not have an after-class session together. He brought the other 2 groups together, gave them a structured environment so they could communicate with each other. Their scores went the same way because it's the wisdom of crowds in terms of sharing knowledge. So how do we create a classroom where the teacher is the guide, not a referee, the guide, break down to small sessions, which I'm sure you do here all the time, break down into small sessions, make assignments, and then let each person in that session be an expert on a specific part of the assignment to then teach in a reciprocal way the other students what they've learned in their little knowledge group, then bring it back to the plenary, and then the teacher's role becomes very difficult, and this is not easy. I face this all the time with our big students, our CEOs. In the main plenary, how does a teacher make sure that even when their presence is there, the young people are allowed to come back and build off each other's ideas, disagree, have their conversations? The teacher's role is to impart her knowledge from her academy and discipline with all of its contradictions. That's her role. But her role is not to then say that's the right answer. Her role is to say, this is the discipline, this is what's happening. But the students may have a different set of creativity that comes in on how they create a consensus. So the teacher's role is really not just an arbitration role, but it's not a manipulation role. It's based on a community of scholars where there is someone in charge, the teacher, but it has to be distributed knowledge, because now everyone's a scholar. They're all teachers in that classroom. Every one of those students is a teacher. And they have to collaborate to create a consensus, and the teacher's job is not Socratic. It's new. It's distributed and collaborative. I don't say that's easy. When I'm sitting there in my classes and time's running out and I'm having them all share and I want to get them to the bottom line, I go in for the kill, as we say, and say this is where it is. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, this gets to one last issue. And remember I said that communication energy revolutions change temporal spatial footprints. Can anybody tell me the first and second industrial revolutions annihilated time and space to a good deal? What was the primary temporal value that came out of the first and second industrial revolution, the Enlightenment? What's the primary temporal value, time value? What? Yeah, now go deeper. And what is time management based on? What's the time value? Productivity, time management, but what's the actual thing you're learning? You got everything but the term. Efficiency. Would you be nonplussed if I told you that this is a relatively new value? Go back and look at Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, 1740. Look up the word efficiency. It'll blow your mind. It was a divinely inspired word. God is the most efficient first actor, pretty efficient. He commands the heavens and earth, so shall it be done. In the late 19th century, to show you how our school systems embed into the energy regime that we have, that this is not abstract, in the late 19th century, our engineers and chemists were studying energy flows through machines. And they were looking at inputs and outputs and entropy, the entropy flow, all right? And they redefined efficiency based on machine values in thermodynamics. So they began to see efficiency as a secular term. Give me a definition of efficiency. Yeah, maximize your output with a minimum input of labor, energy, and capital. Are we right in concluding that efficiency time value is permeated way beyond the factory to the schools, the homes, society? But here's the problem with this time value. And we don't even, I'm just giving you one of many examples to explore in the classroom. Would we ever treat someone we care for efficiently? Would we ever say to a spouse or a sibling, you know, I really love you. So I tell you, I love you so much, I'm going to maximize my output in the minimum time with the minimum labor, energy, and capital. Some of you can discuss this later. Some guilty faces, including me. I'm not Mother Teresa. My wife says I'm the worst problem here than some of this stuff. But the fact is that we would never treat someone we care for efficiently. Classrooms are completely predicated around the question of efficiency and productivity. The students quickly learn that they're a machine and that they have to maximize their output in the minimum time. It mitigates against creating relationships. Can one be efficient? Can one be intimate in an efficient way? Can one have revelation in an efficient way? An epiphany? Joy? I'm not saying we give up efficiency. There needs to be an Aristotelian Talmudic balance in the classroom because you've got to get a job done and got to prepare these kids for the real world. But what I'm suggesting is that we have to balance in the classroom efficiency with an empathic frame of reference. Now, for example, the Waldorf schools, and there's a lot of problems with them, but there's no bell at the end of the hour. You can go and individualize your work projects. When you're teaching art here, it's very hard in the artistic mediums, but even in philosophy, cultural anthropology, to have these time limits, especially when something's going good and you got a roll going with these students. So what I'm suggesting, efficiency is just one of many things we have to re-examine if we can go deeper and deeper to not just the pedagogy, but the process, because the kids actually learn their worldview by the process, not the pedagogy. Does this make sense? So the reason I like what you're doing on interdisciplinary studies, it's just absolutely one of the key things, because with interdisciplinary studies, students learn there is more than one perspective, that we can begin to discuss across disciplines how things relate, because an embodied experience says that knowledge are not abstract, detached facts, that knowledge is shared experiences where we create common meanings in the world. That's the narrative approach. So truth is not something that's detached in the ether in a Platonic sense or a Kantian sense. Truth is all of our shared experiences in which we come up with some common understandings about the world we relate to and how we understand it, whether it's the laws of gravity or thermodynamics or whatever. So if that's the case, then we want to prepare students so they can actually have as many embodied experiences as possible. We also have to get them out of the classroom. You are so blessed here. I mean, we have to get them out of the classroom. I agree with all the folks who want to extend the self to the eco-self. My old friend Ted Rozak and others, they've got to be out of the classroom in places where they can just be and just roam, like they do on the beach or they do on a vacation. So I think interdisciplinary studies teaches people to live with ambiguity, to understand different points of view, to be mindful, to be creative, to be synergistic, and understand that everything's a relationship. All life is a relationship. All life is participation. I think, therefore I am. I participate, therefore I exist. And then finally, I would just say this. Everything I've just said is so damn difficult to do. I mean, I understand this. I just blow it all the time when I'm doing my teaching. I get expedient. I got to move the thing. I want them to hear what I have to say. You know, I want to give them part of all my wisdom. It just happens. You know, maybe we gravitate to teaching for certain ways, but when I do that, I don't really get the opportunity to let them examine their minds together. So keeping that balance between structure but distributing knowledge in a collaborative way is key. And the reason I keep saying distributed and collaborative, the third industrial revolution is the distributed and collaborative communication energy model. Fossil fuels were a centralized top-down model, and they created a school system like that. If we're going to prepare people for a third industrial revolution, we first have to prepare them to think in a distributed, collaborative, empathic way. If we can bring the two together, that's a big deal. That's going to change consciousness in a very dramatic fashion. So what you have here is a really a good start. Now you have to push ahead here, I think, even more, so people can keep trying to catch up. And then, as you say, we got to open source what you're doing here. Open source it in a big way. The key is to create generation after generation of teachers in the next 30 or 40 years. Teacher after teacher after teacher who's a guide.